Bringing the loyal Moluccan soldiers to the Netherlands would be one of the greatest mistakes in the nation's history, with millions of guilders spent on their continued stay, and 9 civilian casualties as a result of their actions. After the Dutch acknowledged the sovereignty of their former colony, the Republic of Indonesia, the province of Maluku would soon be stripped of its provincial status and integrated into a larger republic. After several attempts to restore the East Indonesian state, the former Minister of Justice Chris Sumokil would make contact with Johannes Manusama and together declare the Republik Maluku Selatan, the Republic of South Maluku, which would only last from the 25th of April to September 28, 1950, when the Indonesian army would start the invasion of Ambon. The 3,578 remaining Moluccan soldiers of the East Indies Army would be left in a difficult position. Reviled by the Indonesian people for their support of the Dutch oppressors, they had no support of their own and would now have to decide: join the Moluccan army and fight an unwinnable battle for the Republic, or temporarily move to the Netherlands, where the state would provide for them while trying to negotiate for their independence. It would take some persuading, but eventually the soldiers would be convinced to take the trip. Arriving on Dutch soil, however, they would be relieved of duty and would be made to live in former concentration camps and barracks spread around the country, where they would remain until the 70s before being moved to proper residential areas. They would not be given Dutch citizenship as their stay was temporary, and refused Indonesian citizenship, leaving them stateless in a foreign country. It was this problematic living situation and the lack of action and initiative by the Dutch government that would accumulate into the Moluccan actions. In 1966, the president of the RMS would be executed by the Indonesian army. His widow and son would move to the Netherlands, and the night following their arrival, an act of arson would be committed on the Indonesian embassy. This would start the radicalization of the Moluccan youth, resulting in 7 actions over a period of 8 years, led by a growing hate for the Dutch government and by extension its people, and further fueled by a lack of integration, which had caused many to resort to crime and drugs. Manusama would take over as new president of the RMS, although his influence on both these actions and the cause itself would be inconsequential at best. The day before the state visit of the Indonesian president Suharto, on the 31st of August 1970, 33 young Moluccans planned a charge into the residence of the Indonesian ambassador in Wassenaar in an attempt to take him hostage. The plan was to simply run inside and then ask the government to let Manusama speak to Suharto. Before they even arrived, however, they were spotted by a police officer, who immediately raised his gun in his defense. One of the hostage takers shot in panic, and the officer was killed. In the building, they found the ambassador wasn't home, and elected to take his wife and children hostage instead. After some hours and 2 meetings with government officials, they were convinced by a mediator to leave the premises. With the pledge, officials would relay Manusama's plea to Suharto. They would be arrested and sentenced to 1 year in prison, and would lead Suharto to delay his visit for 2 days and with a much larger security detail. In 1975, 3 actions would take place. The first plan was to take Queen Juliana hostage by ramming the fence of Pellesoesdijk with a rented truck, and storming in with a group of 39 Moluccans. This plan would never be conducted, however, as 2 of the perpetrators would be arrested in their car with a stockpile of weapons. They stated their goal was to force the government to acknowledge the RMS. 17 of the members would be convicted to sentences up to 5 years. These 2 actions show the lack of preparations. Not only did they have no real idea how to make them acknowledge the RMS, but the Queen was actually in Italy at the time, so would never have accomplished anything anyway. On the 2nd of December, the train from Groningen to Zwolle would be stopped by an emergency brake near Wijster, and 7 armed Moluccans would rush in. At this moment, the train driver would open the door to his cabin and immediately shut it again upon spotting the armed hijackers. One of these hijackers would in turn panic and shoot through the door, hitting the driver in an artery in his groin. Refusing to let anyone go, they decided to kill him in an act of mercy. He would not be the only victim, as this time the hijackers were prepared to kill hostages to get what they wanted. Their demands this time were a bus to the airport, as well as a plane, and the release of 3 groups of Moluccans that were convicted for robberies resulting in death. When it became clear the government was not planning to meet their demands quickly, They tried to execute one of the passengers, but he jumped out of the train and was lucky to survive the machine gun fire that followed him. Unfortunately, they opted to execute someone else in response, and another 2 days later. Their bodies would be thrown out of the train, remaining there for multiple days. Almost half of the 60 hostages would escape on the fourth day, and there was no indication their demands were being taken seriously, yet they would still hold out until the 13th. 12 days after it began, all 7 hijackers surrendered without achieving anything and would be sentenced to 14 years in prison. 2 days after the start of the train hijacking, 7 other Moluccans would take hostages in the Indonesian consulate in Amsterdam. The actual main target of this action was, once again, not present, and the other possible targets, some of the employees of the consulate, all escaped through a window. All except one, who got shot at and jumped out of the window, falling to his death. 41 people, including 16 children, were held for 15 days, with daily food rations being delivered while they held one of the hostages at gunpoint on the balcony. The demands were the release of the same prisoners as before, and a meeting between Madusama and Suharto, and they would again not be met quickly. On the 19th, the hostage takers surrendered after receiving vague promises of a meeting, and were convicted to 7 years in prison. 2 actions would start on the same day on the 23rd of May 1977. 4 young Moluccans would enter the primary school in Boven-Smilde and take 5 teachers and 105 children hostage, yet only the Dutch, as they let the Moluccan children go. The threats this time were even more severe. They demanded, among other things, a bus to the airport, a plane to an undisclosed country, the release of 21 prisoners, and commitment to the RMS cause. If non-compliant, they would blow up both locations. To turn up the pressure for officials, they even made a group of kids hang out the window and repeat, "Vannacht we want to live," taunting the Minister of Justice. Still, officials refused to do anything until all children were released. On the 4th day, all children and 1 teacher would be released when an unknown illness ravaged through the school. Exactly what was needed, yet this divine providence might not be so divine. Many believed the food that was brought was poisoned, and this was never denied by officials. On the 11th of June, the army attacked the school with armored vehicles, but no battle was needed, with an immediate surrender of all 4 hostage takers. They were sentenced to 6 to 9 years in prison. The most famous of all the actions was the train hijacking at the Punt. 51 hostages would be held in dreadful conditions for 20 days, with neither side willing to concede. 4 hostages were released for their health towards the end, and mediators came and went, but the stalemate continued. Until the 11th of June, when the army would forcefully end the stalemate. A reconstruction was made many years after the fact that showed the situation and plan.
Men gaat uit van de volgende situatie. Ruim 50 passagiers worden vastgehouden in 2 verschillende compartimenten. Mannen en vrouwen. De 9 gijzelnemers bevinden zich in de kop van de trein, tussen de compartimenten van de mannen en vrouwen en achter de gegijzelden. Deze duidelijke scheiding tussen gegijzelden en gijzelnemers vormt de basis van het plan dat gericht is op de bevrijding en bescherming van de passagiers. In het plan is het essentieel dat de gijzelnemers gescheiden blijven van de gegijzelden. Het plan voorziet erin dat precisieschutters zullen vuren op de trein om te voorkomen dat de gijzelnemers zich mengen onder de passagiers. Straaljagers zullen laag overvliegen, opdat iedereen in de trein verstijft. Mariniers zullen de trein binnendringen, de passagiers bevrijden en de trein veiligstellen, waarbij de mariniers niet mogen vuren op gijzelnemers die zich duidelijk waarneembaar overgeven. Het plan wordt uitvoerig besproken door de betrokken ministers. De consequentie dat waarschijnlijk alle gijzelnemers zullen worden gedood, wordt geaccepteerd.
Unfortunately, 2 hostages were sleeping in one of the connections. One was shot and killed, the other gravely wounded. One of the hijackers was able to run between the hostages and started firing at the soldiers when they approached. When they returned fire, someone got up and was fatally shot. The attack was successful in ending the hijacking, with the deaths of 2 hostages and 6 hijackers. Fearing revenge actions by other Moluccans, the state decided to only charge them with deprivation of liberty and criminal possession of a weapon, resulting in sentences of 6 to 9 years. The last major occurrence would be on the 13th of March 1978, when 3 young Moluccans would invade the county hall of Trente and take 71 hostages. This time they were committed to getting their demands of a plane, the release of the same prisoners plus the 7 from last year, and a 13 million guilder ransom, which would be 34.9 million in 2021. Only an hour in, they would put one of the hostages in front of a window and riddle him with bullets, making his body drop outside. A passing pedestrian was shot, as was the ambulance trying to remove the corpse. With a deadline of 2 p.m. the next day, officials saw no way to negotiate and sent a military squad into the bicycle shed, waiting for any communication from the hostage takers. Nothing would be heard, and at 2:34 p.m. the squad would rush in, just in time, as they were about to execute 2 provincial executives. They would shift their attention to the soldiers, and when firing, wounded one of the executives, who would die a couple weeks later. The 3 would be convicted to 15 years in prison. This final action had no mention of the RMS ideal, and had gone too far. Many in the community were ashamed of their actions, and this and the publication of a policy document on the Moluccan issues would prove to bring the end of their actions. This document proposed new ways to integrate the Moluccans into Dutch society, never mentioning the RMS ideal at all. An investigation that was held alongside the writing of this document showed no one supported the RMS ideal on the Maluku Islands, and anyone that knew about the actions in the Netherlands were very ashamed of their fellow countrymen, especially after the plan involving the Queen. At this point, many had lost faith in ever achieving the ideal and would slowly let go, in favor of fixing the issues in the residential areas like the high unemployment rates. Throughout the 80s and 90s, there remained an extreme amount of surveillance by the BVD, the former Secret Service. All existing groups were monitored to see if they could prove a danger to the nation. Any new group would immediately be reviewed and surveyed. During an important RMS memorial, there were lists made with attendees for further monitoring. There were investigations into the Moluccan youth in every residential area, which included political preferences, naturalization degree, drug usage, criminal record, even if anyone in an area had ever been part of any major incident, including things like bar fights. My favorite finding in my delving through over 3,000 pages of BVD reports is this. A certain group was planning to occupy a government building, yet when they arrived, they found a large police force surrounding and inside the building. Clearly the plan had leaked, but how? This was the question they deliberated in a private meeting with only the most trusted of the group. They concluded the police must have an informant. This was TheLoresanctum. Have a nice day.